Have you ever wondered why a woman's silence has the power to unmake a man more profoundly than her words ever could? The absence of her voice, the withdrawal of her laughter, the refusal of her presence, it strikes him deeper than rage, deeper than tears. For silence is not emptiness. It is not nothingness. It is a mirror, a haunting, a sacred withdrawal of energy that forces the masculine psyche to confront itself without distraction. Carl Jung understood this well. What disappears from the outside must be faced within, and no torment rivals the confrontation a man endures when he is left alone with his ungoverned shadow. A woman's silence is not passive. It is an act of sovereignty. It is the refusal to dance for approval, to perform for validation, to soothe the wounds of a man who has yet to meet his own depths. When she stops explaining, stops defending, stops begging to be understood, something dangerous and erotic emerges. For suddenly she is no longer a character in his story. She becomes an enigma beyond his control. The masculine mind, trained to conquer and categorize, cannot bear the paradox of an untouchable woman. Her silence unsettles because it cannot be solved. It exposes the inadequacy of his power. Men often mistake noise for life. They mistake constant interaction for intimacy. They mistake argument for connection. But silence is the womb from which truth is born. And when a woman embodies it, she becomes untamed, archetypal, part lover, part oracle. He feels her absence not as a gap, but as a haunting presence that lingers, filling the spaces he cannot escape. Her silence echoes in his psyche like an unanswered riddle, like an unfinished symphony. And the more he reaches for her to break it, the more it consumes him. This is where the erotic dimension reveals itself. Not in the obvious display of desire, not in the body offered, but in the withdrawal of availability. The feminine becomes magnetic not by revealing everything, but by withholding just enough to awaken hunger. Jung would remind us that eros itself is tied to longing, to the tension of opposites, to the ache of what is desired but not possessed. Silence intensifies this tension. It electrifies the space between. It makes every glance, every imagined word, every memory burn hotter than the reality ever could. For the man, this silence provokes both terror and desire. Terror because it robs him of the illusion of dominance. Desire because mystery is the oxygen of attraction. What he cannot control, he craves. What he cannot solve, he obsesses over. This is why the woman who can embody silence becomes unforgettable. Not because she withholds as a tactic, but because her silence emerges from an inner abundance, a refusal to spend her essence cheaply. She does not collapse into his hands. She lets him feel the weight of his own emptiness in the absence of her giving. And here lies the forbidden truth. Silence is not a punishment. It is a revelation. It reveals the man's dependence, his addiction to external energy, his inability to sit with his own soul. He may rage against it, call her cold, call her cruel, but in truth he fears her because she embodies what he has not mastered within himself. The Stoics warned that the greatest suffering comes not from others, but from our own inability to govern the self. Marcus Aurelius wrote that a man's worth is no greater than the worth of his ambitions. When a woman falls silent, she exposes the pettiness of those ambitions, his need to dominate, his hunger for reassurance, his desperation for control. For the woman, silence becomes a reclamation. It is the refusal to bleed out her soul in explanations to ears that do not hear. It is the act of stepping back into her own temple, closing the door, and letting him discover what life feels like without her devotion. In this way, silence is erotic because it restores polarity. She becomes untouchable, mysterious, sovereign, and he is forced back into the position of seeker, no longer the possessor, but the one possessed by longing. And you, have you felt this power? Have you ever withdrawn your words and watched how quickly he begins to tremble under the weight of the unsaid? Have you seen how silence unsettles him more than anger, how it pulls him closer even as you move away? That is because silence is not absence, it is presence intensified. It is the essence of the feminine soul saying, I am not here to be consumed, I am here to be honored. Carl Jung would call this the anima in its untamed form, the inner feminine that drives the masculine psyche mad with desire and dread. She is not the obedient wife, nor the comforting mother, nor the accommodating lover. She is the silent muse, the archetypal priestess, the one who withholds not to wound, but to awaken. Her silence becomes erotic because it threatens his ego and calls forth his soul. And in that tension, in that unbearable ache, attraction deepens into obsession. Silence is not the void, it is the crucible. It is the place where illusions burn away, where noise dissolves, where the truth of a man's soul is revealed without ornament. To the masculine psyche, accustomed to the constant hum of attention and the reassurance of being needed, silence becomes unbearable precisely because it removes the narcotic of distraction. Suddenly, he is left alone with himself. And what he finds there is rarely comforting. A man who encounters a woman's silence faces not her absence, but his own lack. The feminine presence has been the mirror that reflects his worth, his potency, his importance. When that mirror is withdrawn, he is confronted with emptiness. He feels himself small, unanchored, insignificant. It is not that she has abandoned him. It is that she no longer props up the false structures of his ego. Jung understood this as the collapse of projection, the moment when the anima, once externalized onto a flesh and blood woman, retreats and forces the man to integrate what he has avoided. He thought she was the source of his life, but her silence teaches him she was only the vessel for his own unlived depths. This is why silence intoxicates. It operates not on the surface level of communication, but on the archetypal level of being. When a woman withdraws into her own depths, she embodies what Jung would call the mysterium tremendum, the awe-inspiring, terrifying mystery of the feminine unconscious. She becomes untouchable, not because she withholds for strategy, but because she reveals herself as more than the sum of his fantasies. In her silence, she is no longer his lover. She is the archetype of mystery itself. And that shift both terrifies and awakens him. The Stoics spoke of restraint as the highest form of power. Epictetus reminded us that no man is free who is not master of himself. Silence is restraint in its purest form. To refrain from speaking when words would be easy, to hold one's ground when explanation would soothe, to embody calm when the world demands chaos. For the woman, silence is erotic, not only because it destabilizes him, but because it stabilizes her. It returns her energy inward, away from the endless expenditure of justification, and into the wellspring of her own self-possession. She ceases to be reactive. She becomes sovereign. And sovereignty is irresistible. A woman who governs her own tongue, who does not scatter her energy in pleas or arguments, radiates a power that men can feel in their bones. She becomes rare, untamed, unpredictable. Her silence carves out a sacred distance that no man can cross without her consent. It is this distance that ignites desire, for nothing inflames longing more than the sense that one stands before a temple whose doors cannot be forced open. Do you see the danger now? Do you see why silence terrifies him? Because words he can counter, anger he can dismiss, tears he can comfort or manipulate. But silence he cannot touch. It strips him of weapons. It leaves him circling outside the gates, consumed by questions he cannot answer. What is she thinking? What has she seen in me? Does she still want me? Is she gone forever? Silence burrows into his psyche until he begins to argue not with her, but with himself. And in that inner argument, the truth of his weakness emerges. Here, silence becomes the erotic weapon Jung might call transformative. For in stripping him of his illusions, it forces him to face his shadow. The jealousy, the insecurity, the hunger for control, the dependency he has hidden even from himself, all rise to the surface when her voice no longer fills the space. And what he feels for her becomes inseparable from what he fears within himself. This is the paradox. Her silence awakens desire precisely because it awakens his unconscious. Some women sense this intuitively. They do not rush to fill the air. They do not try to prove their worth with endless devotion. They let silence do the work that words never could. They let a man unravel in the empty space until he reveals the truth of who he is, not to her, but to himself. That is why such women are unforgettable. Their silence is not neglect, it is initiation. It drags the man into his own underworld. It makes him chase, not because she manipulates, but because he cannot bear the confrontation her withdrawal evokes. This is why silence, far from being passive, is deeply active. It is eros in its most subtle form. It is the art of detachment that does not sever, but intensifies. It is the weapon that does not wound with blood, but with absence, that does not destroy, but transforms. and the man who meets such silence will never forget it, for it marks him with the stamp of his own inadequacy and the haunting allure of a woman who does not need him to complete her. There is a particular cruelty in silence, but it is the cruelty of truth, not of malice. It does not strike with the blade of anger, but with the absence of validation. To a man, this absence can feel like suffocation, like the air itself has been stolen. He has grown accustomed to the rhythm of a woman's reassurance, the soft words, the explanations, the gestures that tell him he is central, desired, necessary. But when those gestures vanish, he is left naked, exposed to the void of his own reflection. What he encounters is not her punishment, but his own dependence. And that realization unsettles him more than any spoken rebuke ever could. Jung described this confrontation as the collapse of the persona, the mask every man wears to convince himself of his adequacy. When a woman falls silent, that mask cracks. He sees himself not as he wishes to be seen, but as he truly is, fragile, unmoored, haunted by the shadow he has tried to bury. The feminine silence is the alchemical vessel in which this cracking occurs. It is not her anger that transforms him, it is her refusal to feed the illusions that anger thrives upon. In silence, she ceases to participate in his performance, and the stage becomes unbearable without her gaze. This is the hidden eroticism. Desire is not only about what is given, but about what is withheld. A man yearns for what he cannot possess, burns for what escapes him, obsesses over what does not answer. The erotic tension is born not from satisfaction, but from delay, from distance, from mystery. And silence is the most potent mystery of all, because it says everything by saying nothing. It forces him to fill in the blanks with his own longing, his own projections, his own fears. Each moment of her silence is a canvas on which he paints his obsession. And you? Have you noticed this? Have you seen how silence draws him nearer? How he searches your face for clues? How he replays every detail in his memory, desperate to decipher the meaning of what you have not spoken? This is not manipulation. It is not a trick. It is the natural gravity of feminine energy when it is no longer wasted in justification. Silence is the fertile soil where his unconscious blooms, where the hunger of the masculine is awakened by the boundaries of the feminine. The Stoics, too, understood the power of restraint. Seneca wrote that he who is brave is free. To hold silence is bravery in its purest form, for it is to resist the urge to control the perception of others, to resist the temptation of noise. In silence, a woman declares her freedom from external validation. She does not plead, she does not argue, she does not explain. She allows reality to stand as it is, and in doing so, she embodies the courage of men both crave and fear. For what is clear, what is braver, than a woman who no longer seeks permission to exist in her face. In this case, silence becomes intoxicating. A woman who can withhold words reveals herself as complete in herself. She does not speak to be validated. She speaks only when she chooses. This sovereignty radiates through every gesture, every glance, every pause. And a man sensing this cannot help but anger. For he does not merely desire her body, he desires the unshakable self-possession she embodies. Her silence is not emptiness, but depth, and he falls into it like a well that has no bottom. But make no mistake, silence also wounds. It forces him into a reckoning he did not ask for. It strips him of the easy comforts of noise. It reveals his dependency on the very energy he once dismissed. And in this wound lies transformation. Jung called this the path of individuation, the painful process of facing the shadow and becoming whole. The woman's silence becomes the initiation that drags him into this process, whether he wants it or not. He may resent her for it. He may rage against it, but he will never forget it, for her silence has marked him, branded him with the memory of the moment he was forced to face himself. And this is where the erotic merges with the spiritual. Her silence is not merely an absence of words, it is a presence of soul. It is the mystery of the feminine archetype, the eternal reminder that some things cannot be possessed, only revered. Her silence is not rejection, it is transcendence. It is the flame that burns without consuming, the riddle that has no answer, the beauty that deepens precisely because it cannot be solved. There comes a moment when a man realizes that her silence is not a pause waiting to be broken, but a world unto itself. It is not the space before words, but the choice that words will never be spoken. And in that realization, desire turns into something darker, more consuming. For silence does not merely withhold, it creates distance, an unreachable horizon that he cannot cross no matter how desperately he runs toward it. It is this horizon that makes him ache, that makes him restless in her absence, that makes him relive every moment she once shared, as though those fragments might explain her quiet withdrawal. Jung would call this the archetype of the eternal feminine, the anima, not as comforter, but as siren. In myth, the siren does not lure with noise, but with the haunting absence of resolution. Her silence is the song that cannot be grasped. The man, intoxicated, leans toward her mystery, unable to resist, even as it unravels him. This is the paradox that silence carries. It denies and yet awakens. It distances and yet binds. It is erotic precisely because it destabilizes the masculine ego, leaving him both terrified and captivated. Consider this. When a woman explains herself, she gives him closure. When she argues, she gives him engagement. When she pleads, she gives him power. But when she falls silent, she gives him nothing. And it is in the nothing that his obsession grows. He cannot heal his wound through dialogue, cannot soothe his ego through control, cannot reassert himself through conquest. He is left with the torment of the unanswered, the eternal ache of the unsolved. Silence is the space where his projections collapse, and in that collapse he feels both lost and alive in ways he never has before. For the feminine, silence is not simply withdrawal, it is creation. It is the drawing back of energy into the self, the refusal to bleed into places where it is neither honored nor cherished. Silence allows her to hear her own voice again, the voice beneath the noise of male desire and demand. It is in silence that she remembers her own worth, not as reflected in the eyes of others, but as inherent, eternal, untouched. This remembrance radiates, and that radiance itself becomes erotic, not because she seeks to entice, but because she has ceased to chase. And you? Do you feel the shift? Do you sense how men respond not to your giving, but to your restraint? Do you see how silence transforms their confidence into anxiety, their certainty into longing, their dominance into pursuit? That is the secret Jung uncovered in his study of the anima and shadow. What is withheld has more power than what is offered. The woman who knows when to speak and when to remain silent is not merely a partner in love. She is a force of nature, a mirror of the unconscious that no man can resist. The Stoics would recognize this too. Marcus Aurelius wrote that he who has power over himself has power over the world. Silence is the mastery of the self, the refusal to let impulse dictate action. It is not coldness, it is clarity. A woman who embodies this clarity radiates a sovereignty that cannot be diminished by any man's neglect or betrayal. She does not react to his shadow, she compels him to confront it. And in that confrontation, he either grows or he breaks. This is why silence is dangerous. It is not a weapon in the shallow sense, not a trick to ensnare. It is dangerous because it awakens what lies dormant. It brings to the surface the buried insecurities, the hidden fears, the unacknowledged wounds. It demands that he look within, and this demand is far more terrifying than any outward conflict. Her silence does not punish, it initiates. And in that initiation, he either begins the work of individuation or becomes trapped in obsession, circling endlessly around the woman who withdrew without explanation. And yet to her, silence is not about him at all. It is about returning to her own axis. It is about refusing to give herself away in fragments, refusing to waste her voice in places where it falls into emptiness. In silence, she reclaims the erotic as hers, not as performance, not as transaction, but as essence. She becomes untouchable not because she hides, but because she no longer seeks. And this untouchability, this quiet sovereignty, burns more brightly than any declaration could. This is the truth Jung hinted at, and men have always feared. Silence is not absence, but presence magnified. It is not rejection, but reclamation. It is the feminine in her purest form, mysterious, whole, sovereign. And in this form, she is no longer someone's lover, someone's possession, someone's mirror. She becomes herself, and in becoming herself, she awakens desire in its rawest, most uncontrollable form. There is a holy weight in silence, a gravity that bends the masculine psyche toward it, whether he wishes to move or not. It is the gravity of the unknown, the pull of mystery, the reminder that not everything can be solved by willpower or possession. To the male ego, trained from birth to conquer, to define, to take, silence is intolerable. Because it resists all three. It is the land that cannot be mapped, the territory that cannot be owned, the truth that refuses to yield under interrogation. And so it becomes erotic precisely because it remains untamed. Jung would remind us that the unconscious thrives in what is not said, in what is suppressed, in what waits beneath the surface. Silence is therefore not an absence, but an entryway. It opens the door to shadow material, to the wounds and desires a man has buried beneath noise. When she withdraws her voice, he begins to hear the voices within himself, the voices of doubt, fear, regret, longing. These are not voices he welcomes, yet they are voices that shape him more than he admits. Her silence does not create them, it unmasks them. And in this unmasking, he becomes unsettled, hungry, and strangely alive. This is why men so often mistake a silent woman for cruelty, when in truth, her silence is revelation. It reveals what he has hidden, what he has relied upon her to cover. Without her words to soothe him, he meets his own fragility. Without her explanations to protect him, he faces his own ignorance. Without her attention to inflate him, he confronts his own insignificance. It is no wonder he obsesses. For in losing her voice, he loses the anesthesia that shielded him from himself. The erotic power here is paradoxical. It is not born from her pursuit, but from her refusal. The masculine ego, tethered to conquest, finds itself compelled by what escapes. The more untouchable she becomes, the more he aches. And yet, this ache is not simply desire for her body. It is the deeper, unconscious yearning for wholeness. Jung called this the drive toward individuation, the need to integrate the lost parts of the psyche. Her silence awakens this drive, not by giving him what he wants, but by taking away what he depended upon. In the void she creates, he feels the hunger of his own soul. And you? Do you recognize this hunger when it rises in him? Do you see how quickly his bravado falters, how easily his composure cracks, how urgently he returns when your words are no longer flowing toward him? This is the moment he begins to sense that your silence is not weakness but power. He begins to realize that you are not orbiting his gravity. He is orbiting yours. The center has shifted, and now it is he who longs to be pulled back into the warmth you once offered freely. The Stoics would call this the discipline of withdrawal. To refrain from reacting is to reclaim power. Seneca warned that he who constantly reacts is enslaved, while he who holds silence is free. For the feminine, silence is not coldness but freedom. It is the refusal to be enslaved by the need to explain, to justify, to win affection. In silence, she becomes her own witness, her own guardian, her own source. And that freedom, when embodied, radiates as a kind of quiet fire, a fire men feel even in her absence. This fire burns because it is rare. So many women are conditioned to fill the air with noise, to soothe, to perform, to chase. But the one who does not chase, the one who falls silent instead of begging to be heard, becomes extraordinary. She breaks the pattern. She embodies mystery. She forces a confrontation that is as erotic as it is terrifying. The confrontation with a woman who does not need him. And this is the most forbidden truth of all, that the most erotic thing about a woman is not her body, nor her words, nor her promises. It is her sovereignty. It is the sense that she is whole without him, that she could walk away and remain complete. Silence embodies this sovereignty in its purest form. It says without speaking, I am enough unto myself. And this declaration, though unspoken, strikes the masculine heart with more force than any plea ever could. Jung once wrote that the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. Silence is the element that catalyzes this reaction. It strips away illusion, destabilizes ego, awakens longing, and forces transformation. To the man, it feels unbearable. To the woman, it feels liberating. And in the space between his torment and her freedom lies the deepest erotic charge of all. The woman who understands this no longer fears silence. She does not rush to fill it. She lets it deepen, lets it grow, lets it speak for her. And in doing so, she becomes unforgettable. For silence is not merely absence. It is the echo of the eternal feminine, the voice of the soul speaking without sound. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase. She chooses.